Troy, we're not out here. What's everybody's role here? We got a clerk.
We got a clerk for him. We got a clerk for him.
Good proposal.
I mean, like, yeah.
It's on the 6th, I'm sorry. It's an equal. I'm sorry.
Imagine the next 6 weeks are gonna fly.
Yeah, pretty crazy. And I don't,
Yeah.
I don't even know. But on a cold rainy day, and I was like, I can look out at cold rainy day from my office versus my house.
Yeah.
I can go out and
Meetings in an hour and a half. Yeah.
he's gonna take the vote sheets and upload.
Oh,
The printer's over there.
Well, the printer's right there with John.
when he finishes, he's gonna give them to him and put them in his office.
Good afternoon. For those of you who are waiting for the Subcommittee on Elementary and Secondary Education to start, we are simply waiting for a few of our colleagues to come over from the Capitol, and we appreciate your patience.
This day and age. But she couldn't have done 10, 15 years ago.
So, yeah, what didn't get me on. Right. And that's like, and I was like, I'm gonna go this year, I'm gonna try DVD class. So I really got into enjoying taking my class every day. Right. You know, and then, George, we need more staff.
That's what I just came over to say. We need reinforcements.
Susan was here, but she decided to take it in because there was enough of us.
Yeah. There's a student who works for DCR, and she started
This one.
on Monday from 12:15 to 12:45, and her book was really fantastic. And I paid in the classes.
She would do it.
Yeah. And it's $15
So you input the votes.
Well, I mean, it's like, you kind of like, she was doing it for a while and then sitting on.
Nothing, just to get it
And
done.
now you
Just
feel
get it done.
like, you know, you got to Yes, I'm excited about that.
So they have to.
So then when the full committee's over, he knows all the subcommittees are out of the way and he can handle the full committee. Because otherwise you have to go back and do the subcommittees first. Of course, I don't know what told me, because I did this.
We will convene the subcommittee at this time. I have communicated with our fellow colleagues. They've encouraged us to go ahead and start, and we appreciate their consideration. We have several senators here to present on their legislation. I don't see Senator Stewart, I do see Senator Surville. Senate Bill 785 is the second on our list of 3 bills. Senator Surville. There you go. Okay, we can hear you now. So.
Great, thank you. Okay, Senate Bill 785 has had a 6-year history now, I believe. I think it's the second time it's been run this subcommittee, what it has to do with is creating standards for the school systems who choose to use electronic textbooks in a classroom. The bill, as I originally introduced it 6 years ago, got referred to a joint education technology subcommittee that Delegate Byron set up. We had 3 big meetings over the summer. That legislation was similar to this, got approved by JCOTS, came to the House, I think in 2015, died in the Education Committee on a tie vote. I introduced it to the Senate, came out of the Senate in 16, passed, came over here, no, died in the House on a tie vote in 16. Last year, Chairman Newman asked me to refer it to the Joint Subcommittee on Education and Technology, which I did. It was vetted by Dr. Bell, and so now it's back this year, having been vetted twice, heavily. And basically what the bill does is it says that if any school system chooses to use electronic textbooks in a classroom, they have to provide a digital device so that every student in that classroom is capable of actually reading that book, both in the classroom and at home. It does not have any kind of a requirement for broadband in the home. It does have a requirement for broadband in the school, which was my understanding that at least as of 3 years ago, 97 or 8% of all schools in the state met that requirement. So there's no home broadband requirement. It does not require any school system to use electronic textbooks. It only says if they choose to use it, this is what they must do. It does not make illegal any existing bring your own device programs that some schools have. It does not prohibit localities from using donated or recycled computers. I don't know if you all are familiar with the Virginia Star program in Prince William County that provides computers to about 40-some jurisdictions, which we provide funding for. I think it's a pretty simple bill that we need to pass. It passed the Senate unanimously. The big thing I want to point to you all out to the committee is that our Constitution requires every child to be given a free textbook. It's in the Constitution, it's been there since 1904. I don't know how our schools can be meeting that constitutional mandate if every child is given electronic books that they can't read. So they need to have a device in order to be able to look at them. And so this says that if the school system chooses to use electronic books, this is how they have to do it. It's not require them to do it. They don't want to buy computers, they can just stay with their paper books. So that's what it basically does. And I would hope you would favorably consider.
Thank you, Senator. Would you like to ask a question now, Delegate Lands? Okay, Delegate Lands.
The chairman controls all things. Senator Surville, you made the constitutional argument for this bill. Are you saying that the framers of the 1902 Constitution of the Commonwealth of Virginia envisioned that we would have digital textbooks?
I'm sure they did not envision that at all, but I think the reality of it is they think every child ought to have a book they can carry around with them in order to learn with. In order to, I think, meet the intent of that, I think you have to have the computing books, if you choose to use electronic textbooks.
Senator Surville, on the constitutional questions, I think we are familiar with that provision. Have you ever solicited opinion from the Attorney General's office on the actions of these local governments, which you say are abhorrent to the Constitution?
No, I haven't. I've thought about it, and I know Senator Watkins, when JCOTS approved it, encouraged me to file a lawsuit because he thought
That was
it would
my
be
next question, Senator, for a declaratory judgment of some kind.
But I would also point out that I think it was in 2014, and I have a letter here from the Secretary of Education, Arnie Duncan, where he provided a letter of guidance to school systems across the entire country. And it has it's 25 pages long and has a specific section on technology. And that section specifically indicates that that the Office of Civil Rights, the Department of Education considers whether or not the school system provides adequate technology to provide accessibility to all children regardless of economic circumstances, et cetera. And so I think in light of the DOE guidance, coupled with our Constitution, I don't think there's any question, but no, I have not ever requested a specific formal legal opinion.
Thank you. And you and I spoke offline. Have you approached the locality to see whether this problem could be solved locally? And if so, what was the response by the locality in question?
I've approached Fairfax County about it. I've had discussions with Prince William County about it as well. I have not had discussions with other localities. With regard to Fairfax County, by the way, I represent 3 different localities, or counties, 6 localities, 3 counties. Fairfax County initially rolled out electronic textbooks 9 years ago in the midst of the budget problem we had, mainly to save money. So they took a bunch of money, saved a bunch of money, they reprogrammed it instead of buying devices with it. What they've told me is that to roll out what they would call a one-to-one program throughout the entire county would be about $40 or $50 million. They've already outfitted, I think, 1 or 2 of 23 pyramids, high school pyramids in the county. And so to them, it's been mainly a budget issue. The superintendent told me that this year he intends to roll out a one-to-one program in all high schools. The school board approves it. Prince William County, they say it's, again, budget, although it's not clear to me how many classrooms are actually using electronic textbooks in the county. Again, if you read the bill carefully, what it says is that if you're using an electronic textbook in a classroom, all the students in that specific classroom have to be provided the device, and the device has to go home only if they require use of the book at home. Senator Dunman added that last clarification to the bill this last time to try and narrow it down as tightly as possible.
So Senator, just so I understand, you're suggesting that there may be savings, considerable savings that are achieved through the use of electronic textbooks, but that those savings are not being reinvested to ensure that there is equal access to electronic textbooks for all students. Those funds are being used to whatever in the school, the XYZ program or support. Is that correct?
Precisely.
And have you asked for that detailed budget data? Have they been able to provide you with any transparency on that point?
No, I haven't. They haven't provided it, nor have I asked for it. But that's kind of what's been articulated to me is the original justification for using electronic textbooks in Fairfax. I haven't had a really in-depth conversation with Prince William or staff.
Thank you, sir. Are there other questions, members of the subcommittee? Anyone here to speak in favor of your bill?
By the way, I think it's a statewide problem, and whatever it's worth, there's 4 systems in the state that have one-to-one. Arlington, Alexandria, Henrico for 16 years, Albemarle, Chesterfield, 5 jurisdictions.
Thank you. We'll look to try to get some of that data. I think we can do that in other manner. Are there those here who would like to speak in opposition to this legislation? Please come forward.
Mr. Chairman, Stacey Haney with the School Boards Association. We are opposed to this legislation. It's an unfunded mandate on our local school divisions. Actually, as of last year, 92% of schools had the bandwidth, the 100 kilobits per second per student, which is what the bill requires. So most schools have that bandwidth, but not all of them, and particularly in the rural areas, they're not quite there yet. And it's really out of the school division's hands because we don't build infrastructure. We don't, a school system can only have whatever bandwidth the companies, run for us to connect to. So that's one issue that particularly rural school divisions have difficulty with. Also, switching to electronic textbooks does not save money. If you look on the Board of Education's website, they're all the approved textbooks, paper and electronic, and the costs of them. And if you look at that, you'll see that it's not substantially cheaper to buy electronic textbooks. And finally, Mr. Chairman, many school divisions are moving towards one-to-one, but they're not all there yet. And just like with a paper textbook, if we have a paper textbook today, if you have kids in school, you might have noticed it's different than when I was a kid and I had all my books and I could take them home I want it. Students don't have textbooks where they take them home every night, and that's how we work with paper textbooks now. And so that's how it works with electronic textbooks as well. But this bill would change that and would require us to either go one-to-one or not use electronic textbooks, which I don't think is the direction that we want to go either.
Thank you very much. Mr. Smith?
Tom Smith, Superintendent's Association. In association with the comments from VSBA, we agree with those, but also part of the question I get back from superintendents when we show them this bill is, if this is a position that the state wants to go, where is the state's money part of it that would help us, one, either do the connectivity, or two, buy the computers to the extent that they're asking. So that is what we would like to see. I don't believe there's ever been a budget amendment put in for this. And so if that is the policy, then we would like some help in moving forward with it.
Thank you very much. There's a Bill Landis likes to say we're very data-driven. We wanted to work with the patron to get the data that I think we need on this. Closing remarks, Senator Sorrell, and then we'll go from there.
So, I think the education committees in both chambers heard all these policy arguments, and also the budget arguments, but point out a couple things with regard to the things you just heard. Number one, I was in the Broadband Commission, I think, for 4 years, before I was elected to the Senate, and I had to give up my spot. And one of the things we talked about on the Broadband Commission was Governor McCall's Education Superhighway Initiative, which was funded by an outside grant. And that organization was trying to get all of our local school systems to use the federal E-rate program to fund their broadband, because they were paying all kinds of crazy prices, and some of them needed to save, could obtain much cheaper broadband. And after we did all that, my understanding was that 97% of the schools in the state met the federal broadband requirement, which was, I have in the bill here, 100 kilobits per second per student. And that was just 3 years ago. So I'm not sure where this 92% thing 3 years later is coming from, but I was on the Broadband Commission. That's the data we were given. It's online. I can give you the site, pull it up, print it out, and give it to you right now. But that's number one. Number two, with regard to school systems that don't have adequate broadband, then I would submit if they don't have adequate broadband at the school, I would question whether they ought to be using electronic textbooks in the classroom at all. They ought to stick to paper. This bill doesn't require them to use electronics. It says if you do, here's what you have to do. Number three, just again, focus on that bill text, which everybody keeps wanting to ignore. Senator Donovan made this really clear with her amendment. It says, number one, they have 3 years to adopt a plan. The bill doesn't require them to have the electronic text of the computers now. It says that by 2020, they have to have a plan to ensure that by 2020, so you have 2 years, each student enrolled in such course will have actual access to its school, and if any assignment requires an electronic use of such electronic textbook outside of school hours, it is residence to one computing device. So it's based on the curriculum in the school. If the teacher requires a child to use a computer at home, then the computing requirement kicks in. But it doesn't kick in, it's just to use one in a classroom. And Senator Donovan put in that language to make it very clear. And so I think a lot of people are overreading this bill, or perhaps they're looking at versions of it that were 3 or 4 years old. The version of it now has been so narrowed down in terms of to make it clear that you only have to get the computer the kids hand in their house if that book has to be used in their house. And I don't know any other way I could thread the needle on this, but and I'm happy to go get the Attorney General's opinion and find all jurisdictions in violation of the law if everybody wants that. But I think it's easy just to tell them this is how you deliver this service. We're going to use it so we don't have a two-tiered school system where the kids that can afford it can read their books, and the kids who can't even look at their book.
Thank you, sir. Any questions or comments from members of the subcommittee? Senate Bill 785. What is the committee's pleasure? We have a motion to lay Senate Bill 785 on the table. Please cast your vote on the electronic voting board. Please close the roll. Bill's laid on the table 5-3. Thank you, Senator.
Thank you.
Senator Newman. Senate Bill 969.
Mr. Chairman, there is a substitute that came from your committee on education. I hope you have that substitute from you.
Is everyone have a substitute for them? Okay, from House Education. We don't have to adopt that today.
I understand.
Thank you, Senator.
Mr. Chairman, if you don't mind me giving you a brief history of time on this, as most of you know, we walked into the standards of learning when math, history, science, and English scores were going down. We adopted that, and math, history, science, and English scores got better. It was a good move. It was tough. It was a good move. No Child Left Behind came along and added an enormous number of tests to that, and we ended up starting to teach to the tests, and we ended up under the federal ESSA program being able to eliminate in high school from 12 tests down to 4 tests. The state school board determined recently that they were going to move forward with math, science, and English, but when it came to history and social studies, they were going to basically allow that to be a local option, well, not a local option, but a local test, and it would be graded locally, and we would lose all of our metrics on it. Many of you have been here long enough to know that the Code of Virginia is full of requirements for social studies that must be taught, and I think many of you understand the importance of social studies. My bill was originally put in, would have just simply taken us back to, instead of going from 12 down to 3, down to 4 SOL tests. The subcommittee in your body has come up with a substitute that I think I still like. And basically what it does is it does allow for the performance assessment tests, but with some very important criteria. One, it says that they will be statewide produced tests. Number 2 is that they will be graded at a statewide, at a kind of a third-party level, and that it does give all the ways that you can go around those tests today, which are currently in place. Mr. Chairman, as you probably see, to come up with these tests, which have been very expensive under Pearson in the past, this bill does kind of cap out those costs at $450,000. The Senate had a number going into this of $300,000, and we did put $300,000 into the budget to save the social studies test. Since then, the department has determined that it most likely will cost $450,000, and we're going to continue to work on that item. I think we can get there. I hope so. So that is what the bill before you does.
Thank you, Senator. Other questions of the Senator at this point? We hear from folks who are in the audience in support of Senate Bill 969.
Mr. Chairman, member of the committee, I want to thank Senator Newman for his work on this bill and working with the state board. Superintendent's Association is in support of the substitute.
Thank you. Ms. Gabe.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair, members of the committee, Cindy Cage, Virginia Department of Education. We are appreciative to Senator Newman for working with us on this bill and supporting.
Thank you, Ms. Gabe. Anyone else in favor of Senate Bill 969? Ms. Gabe, I'm sorry. I should have asked it. You went away quickly. I apologize. Because I'm looking at the bill, it directs DOE with such funds that are available to develop a statewide performance assessment or series of assessments that will be centrally scored on a standardized scoring rubric. Is that meaning that you would do that within existing funds, or is that, have you committed to doing that from the department?
Well, I believe.
It's an enactment clause. It's not the clause. It's
Oh, Mr. Chair, I was about to say, I thought the clause was taken off that
Yeah,
bill by
right.
the House. No, we are looking for the sources to be able to develop the statewide standardized performance assessment that Senator Newman was referring to.
Anyone to speak in opposition to Senate Bill 969? Committee, any questions or comments? Senator, would you like to have any final thoughts on the legislation?
Mr. Chairman, I thank you for letting me comment. That's basically what it does. It's a decision on whether or not social studies needs to be something we account for or not.
Okay, thank you.
It's not allotted in the House budget, so I'll move that.
There's a motion to lay Senate Bill 969 on the table. Please cast your votes on the electronic voting board. Please close the roll. Bill's laid on the table 6-2. Thank you, Senator. Senator Reeves, are you here to present for Senator Stewart? Is that what you're?
No, Mr. Chairman, I think I'm in the third or fourth.
Oh, okay, I just want to make sure. I don't see Senator Stewart. I think we've heard his bill before. Members of the subcommittee, if you recall, Delegate Thomas had a bill which was either identical or nearly identical to Senator Stewart's legislation. He did not act favorably on that bill. I know that you've been able to read the legislation Senator Stewart has put forward. I think there may be some elements to it that have merit, but may not be ready. But we did not act favorably on Delegate Thomas's bill. We have Senate Bill 205 before us. House rules say you shall consider legislation. So to you whether you want to take any action on that bill based on prior actions of this body without the Senate present. We have a motion from Delegate Knight, it's properly seconded, to lay Senate Bill 205 on the table. Please cast your votes. Bill is laid on the table. I believe that completes our docket.
You ain't heard all this. Oh, no, I don't.
Yeah.
Yes.
hearing all the questions and sharing.
No. Yeah.
Hi there.
Yeah.
I have ideas for next year.
I'm good, can you share it before the end of
I have a really good idea. Really good.
First bill we're going to take up is Senate Bill 73. Senator Cosgrove has talked to us about this. He is.
Is there a substitute or is there a amendment that we need to adopt?
Mr. Chairman,
Mr. Chairman.
the Standing Transportation Committee adopted an amendment that did not address all the concerns the Department of Transportation had, but before you today, on IHOD, there will be an alternate amendment on line 18, being a gross bill after the word combination, you would insert having no less than 42 feet of axle space between the extreme axles. The Standing Transportation had 35 feet, but VDOT believes the larger spacing is required to limit the damage on the bridges that are impacted under this legislation, that would spread the load sufficiently that it would greatly reduce any damage to the roadways.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll move that amendment.
Motion's been properly moved and second. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed, nay. Just for clarification, that would conform this bill to what the current House bill is, conform with Delegate Knight's bill. Is that correct?
That is correct. It would be identical to legislation that you all passed.
Is there anyone wishing to speak in favor of this bill?
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, Andrew Smith, Virginia Farm Bureau Federation, we do support the bill and appreciate VDOT working with us to find a number on this sprint axle that's appropriate for this. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, Jonathan Harding with Virginia Agri Business Council, we are also in support. Thank you.
Anyone wishing to speak in opposition to this bill?
Mr. Chairman, I move that we report Senate Bill, recommend for reporting Senate Bill 73 as amended.
It's been moved and properly seconded that Senate Bill 73 be reported as amended. All those in favor signify on the electronic voting board. Bill reports 8-0.
Yeah.
Next up before the committee is Senator Stanley's Senate Bill 181. Senator Stanley, how are you, sir?
Mr. Chairman, nice to see you again, sir. Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, Senate Bill 181 before you basically is a clean repeal of the suspension of licenses in the Commonwealth of Virginia merely for the payment of fines. As it stands right now, we have over 600,000 people who have suspended license merely for a suspended fine, not because of any driving behavior. Usually, of course, those fines and costs are incurred by driving behavior or some other thing, but not that the court imposed a suspension itself. 670,000 people suspended for the non-payment of fines. Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, that is usually because they are unable to pay fines. What I've seen in the research that I've done, as you know, we suspend fines within 30 days of the adjudication after appeal. If those people cannot pay fines or come up with a payment plan with the court, once they're suspended, they are suspended indefinitely. Some people who are at or below the poverty level have fines in multiple courts with costs, and as they go to collection, as you know, those fines become judgments and can be enacted on and gone after for as judgments. But if they start piling up, then they never get their license back. What we've seen, especially in my area, representing those, I do indigent work for a court in my area, and what I usually see is most people that come in with driving unsuspended come in because of non-payment of fines, and the hole has just gotten too deep. And then what happens, especially in smaller communities where I'm from, what we're seeing is that, I hope that was a book. All right. So after, where was I? So after that, it perpetuates, and for those that may be working for them, like, our local sheriffs know them. Watch them pass by on the street, turn around, get them again, and now they get caught for driving unsuspended. Then, as you know, the conviction for driving unsuspended continues the suspension for as long as the last suspension at the maximum, or at least at a minimum of 10 days extra. At this point in time, what we're trying to do is make sure that those that cannot pay those fines, pay the fines, but at the same time, aren't penalized. We talk about big government here, and we don't like government in our lives. What we're seeing is the suspension of a privilege to drive merely because you can't pay the government's tax. And Mr. Chairman, I work in the court system a lot. So you have a $25 fine. By the time they walk out with all the fees that we've imposed, it's $145, $150. And that $25 fine becomes bigger than what that person can pay, or the decisions that they're making, or whether they put food on the table for their children or socks on their feet, or they pay a fine and risk losing their license. What this bill also does is it makes you pay the $145 reinstatement fee. You may have seen, and I sent a letter around, if not, a new fiscal impact statement, which definitely shows that the impacts with 638,000 individuals who are suspended for fines alone, in the final paragraph of the first page on the fiscal impact statement, it says, at present, though, with those 638,000 individuals who could have their driver's license reinstated, through this legislation, they pay the $145 reinstatement fee. While it's not possible to determine how many of them would do it, for every 10% that do, $2.87 million in revenue would be generated for the Department of Motor Vehicles, and $6.38 million would be generated for the trauma fund. So this is actually a revenue generator. What we're trying to do is put people so they're not tax burdens, because if they lose their job, they can't drive, or they keep coming in contact with the court system merely because they can't pay the fines. They're becoming burdens on our system, which incur costs to us. What we're trying to do is encourage behavior that makes people taxpayers and good citizens. And so this bill attempts to do that in a way that we have not been successful for. I will say this in closing, Mr. Chairman, that in looking at the studies and all of that which we've had, you will notice I had a bill last year with Delegate Lapasi. We combined our two bills. The collection period used to be 30 days, so they'd be immediately sent to collection. So we were losing revenue on the state side for those collection efforts. They're sent to law firms. Law firms do the collections, take a little piece. What we were finding in the study is that most people will pay their fines and can pay their fines within 45 and 60. What we were finding now, and currently, is even with Delegate Lapasi's system, by trying to set up a payment plan in order to keep the license, that wasn't effective. It's not shown any reduction in suspensions. It has not shown any reduction in who's already been suspended. And what we're seeing is once those licenses are suspended, Mr. Chairman, we have an 18% collection rate. That's it. So it's not like this is then holding up the ability to collect those fines in the future. We've got to find a better way to do that. And I think that this goes for that. I would also say I've looked at every other way for collection methods and maybe restricted licenses. And even under our statute where we're allowed restricted licenses, and we have that under 462395, you have to have it. It's only for currently employed people. You have to go to the courthouse and get it, which is no guarantee. If there are multiple unpaid fines for the suspension cost, then you have to go to multiple courts and get it. And Mr. Chairman, more significantly, you're not, let's say 650,000 people want to go get a suspended license and restricted license. You're talking about a clog and a cost on our dockets and our court systems. But more often than not, what Mr. Chairman, I would remind everybody, and I have Delegate Peace, and you work in this kind of field too, is that restricted licenses are only good for 6 months. So that person would have to keep coming back to court every 6 months. So for those reasons, Mr. Chairman, that's the bill.
Thank you, Senator. Senator, I think that many of us here believe that the underlying policy what you're trying to accomplish is laudable, and think also that it's something that we need to take and figure out. But I'm not sure at all that we have figured out the details of how this is going to work moving forward, particularly with funding of the trauma fund. As these, I know we still have the 600 folks, 1,000 folks out there, that number that's quoted to us, but this essentially takes away all future funding for that trauma fund moving forward, because they're no longer paying fees because we're no longer suspending. Do you have any plan for how we replace those dollars?
Mr. Chairman, if we look at the division, I mean, at 10% of 638,000, you're talking about revenues of $6 million, which would be an ultimate, if we were able to generate that much revenue, because $100 goes to the trauma fund, would be $63 million to the trauma fund, which is a substantial amount of money to the trauma fund. I don't know that it's collecting that much anyway. Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, I'd also say, so I think there's potential for that kind of collection. The potential is to collect ultimately $63 million. That's a pretty good lick, as we like to say. But secondarily, Mr. Chairman, there are other reasons why licenses are suspended other than the non-payment of fines. So that reinstatement fee of $145 is paid by others who pay the reinstatement fees based on the suspension of the license for whether it be for a driving behavior, where the court suspended the license, a drug conviction where it is required under federal law for us to receive transportation funds that we suspend licenses, non-payment of child support or falling behind child support payments. We seem to like to suspend licenses there when we want them to pay. So there are a lot of other instances where that $145 will be paid over time. What I can tell you, Mr. Chairman, is right now with 638,000 people suspended, we are not getting $63 million. And so I'd see this as a benefit to the trauma fund, not a future detriment to the trauma fund. I think right now, without having that money, that's the detriment to the trauma fund.
Any other questions or questions from the committee? Anyone in the audience wishing to speak in favor of this bill?
Mr. Chairman, committee members, Amy Bullard with Legal Aid Justice Center. I've already spoken with many of you about this bill, and I think the senator has outlined all of the issues very well. I just would point out a couple more things. I know that we like to talk in terms of, actual balance sheets and numbers, but this is a policy that has been creating significant cost to the Commonwealth, not just for folks who can't pay off their debts, but these are generating, just in the last 5 years, over 72,000 cases of driving without, driving on a suspended license each year that are clogging up our courts. Folks penalized under this statute have generated 1.74 million jail days sentenced to them under this policy. So folks are actually spending time in jail with the root cause of this statute. So this current policy is generating many more costs than we are even recouping from the folks who owe this debt. I think it's a very simple policy to repeal this statute. We are creating this cycle of unemployment, jail, and deeper debt with those who fall under it. And to take away the barrier of not having your driver's license, very simply, is going to enable people to go to work, to make the money, to not only take care of themselves and their families, but to pay down this debt. If we ever hope to recoup that debt, and I think that's the outcome that we're all seeking, we need to enable people to work and make money to do that. So we strongly support this bill. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, I have a question for you.
Delegate Gary.
I'm intrigued by, do you have data to show that simply having a driver license equates with gainful employment and all the comments that you just made? It's intuitively obvious that that's the case. I get that. But do you actually have data to show? And I guess to that point, I wonder if there's some way of modulating this to say that those that actually are gainfully employed that need that car to get to work, not just want the car. These are choices some people make. I get it. Some people can't afford it. Do you have data to actually support what we say?
Mr. Chairman, Delegate Garrett, I don't have specific data to your point. I do know that this is a critical poverty issue. When we take a look at
I get that part. I'm more just trying to figure out if there's actual, because I get it. If we can, in fact, simply by giving them it's the whole comment about giving them an insurance card, that doesn't necessarily make them healthier. My question is, if you give them a license, driver's license, that necessarily make them work and gainful work healthier.
I don't have a specific point, but one thing I would point out is taking away folks' driver's licenses doesn't just impact the folks who
Sure.
want to go to the store and this kind of thing. It impacts commercial driver's licenses as well. And Delegate Stolley, when we had talked about the restricted license statute yesterday, that does not apply to commercial licenses. So folks who depend on needing to drive as their employment, truck drivers, bus drivers, all of these types of things, they would be out of work. So I think there's a very specific link there at least.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman, Eldon James on behalf of Virginia Goodwill Network. Goodwill Industries sees this problem every day, especially with the low-wage workers. Goodwill's mission is to try to help people knock down barriers to employment. Lack of dependable transportation is a barrier. This is just one element of that lack of dependable transportation. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, members of the subcommittee, Christine Nara, on behalf of the Virginia Poverty Law Center, and I too have spoken to most of you about our support of this legislation. And just a couple of points to emphasize, and that the first one being, and this is in response to Dr. Garrett's question, of course we don't have specific data, and though I was just trying to find it, there have been some studies that talk specifically about how many people in Virginia have to rely on cars to get anywhere because of the lack of public transportation. And we know that outside of the Eastern Crescent, there is virtually no public transportation available to people. And even within the Eastern Crescent, for example, in my hometown of Richmond, though you can get, and we think of that as one of the places where we have public transportation, though you can get to a certain point within the city and slightly outside of the city on our bus transportation, you can't get out to Short Pump, where a lot of the good entry-level jobs are for people like my clients, who most of whom don't have college degrees or professional degrees. And so while, Dr. Garrett, I think you dig a little bit, and I was just trying to do the search, I apologize for not having that now, but I know there is at least some information about how many people in Virginia rely on cars. It is a tremendous number. And that's what we're talking about here. We are talking about making people employable. And so while there may not be specific data on how many would be employed, this is what would make them employable, and that's critical. And certainly for the folks that Ms. Willard was talking about who actually need that commercial driver's license to get a job and who cannot even get a restricted license. And the other thing I would point out is that we have some very good, good methods of collecting this money, even where, and we believe that most of the people, were they able to keep their license, would make payments voluntarily when they get a job. But even if they didn't, the collection methods that you currently have in place, such as a garnishment, such as other forms of traditional collection methods, can only be effective to the extent that people have money coming. You have, in fact, in the Department of Taxation, an office set up specifically to collect these debts that has a very high rate of return. In fiscal year 16, they had a rate of return of 84%. But they can't collect money from folks who can't go to work because they don't have driver's licenses. And as far, I think that Senator did an excellent job answering questions about the trauma fund. And I would just reemphasize that while it is, of course, true, Mr. Chairman, that at some point there would be a need to fund that trauma fund through some other source. According to the fiscal impact statement that you all have, there's an expectation that the $145 reinstatement fee from the 650,000 plus people who would be able to reinstate should this bill become law would be able to sustain the trauma fund at its current $5.8 million per year from the reinstatement fees for the next 10 years. And I would submit to you all that during that time, there could well be a very, very successful effort to find a more appropriate, sustainable source of funding for the trauma.
Senator, last words?
Only something I just thought of, Mr. Chairman, thank you for the time and the consideration on this piece of legislation. I think it's important for us to, no matter what, have a conversation, because what we're trying to do is break the cycle of poverty. And we perpetuate sometimes as a government the cycle of poverty and create the tax burdens that we then, rail against. And another thing that I was thinking about was, I remember my clients, if they lose their license and they're suspended, then they can't register their car. And if they can't register the car, then the DMV doesn't get the car registration money. And if they can't register the car and the DMV doesn't get the registration money, they can't get the car insured. And if they can't get the car insured, chances are, as many as I've known, have to get to work or have to take their kids to the hospital or daycare or to school, that they're going to drive anyway, and they're gonna do so in a way that is, not open and notorious, but kind of sneaky and in the back. But more importantly, if they're riding around and they can't register the car, and they have no insurance, then the person who may be out on the road by an accident, or no fault of their own, or by just a simple accident, not by malice or anything else, might be then engaging in an accident that is not covered by insurance. There are a whole host of things that, in trying to think, we're trying to collect a government debt, and so we're gonna take away your privilege to drive, that have consequences far-reaching that I don't think we intended to do. And again, is the government gonna sit there and say you can't eat red meat because you're not paid, you didn't pay all your taxes? Are we gonna say that you can't do this or can't do that? Are we going to say, well, you're gonna have to be unemployed, which will mean you'll never be able to pay off your fines and fees and court costs? Because we're gonna take your license, and then you can't drive, because then you get more trouble, you'll have a class 1 misdemeanor, which is driving on the street is. And guess what? Then you're gonna go on to public welfare. And then we're going to pay them, rather than to take revenues from them being good citizens. And I thank you, sir.
Thank you, Senator.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to ask Senator a question.
Sorry, I was kidding.
Since
My mom said my eyeballs.
Since we are all about evidence-based policy here, would you be open to a sunset clause on this to see what happened after 4 years?
Sure, absolutely.
And we can find out what happened to the trauma fund, whether it helps it or hurts it.
Mr. Chairman, I'd answer the gentleman by saying, sure. I mean, here's what we want. We want the reinstatement fee paid, and we want the trauma fund funded. We want the fines and court costs paid because they help our courtrooms and our courthouses. We want people to drive and stay employed. If there's a tracking mechanism, obviously there's a way to track who doesn't have a license and when they get it back, how they're doing, to be able to ascertain whether this is really changing the way that we're handling not only fines and court costs.
Mr. Chairman, I would have a motion for the time.
Any other questions from
Mr. Chairman, I would move that we add a 4-year sunset clause into this legislation, that report back to see what happens to the trauma fund and any other financial impact this may have on the Commonwealth.
Is that a motion?
It's a motion.
It's been moved and seconded. All those in Delegate Sickle, or Delegate Garrett? So we have a substitute motion before us to carry over to 2018. Carry over to 2018, and it's been properly, 2019, it's been properly seconded. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Opposed, nay?
No.
Ayes have it. Senator, bill's carried over to 2019.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for your consideration.
Subcommittee, that concludes the business before us. Thank you all very much.
Go back, yeah, go back to that.
I'll go back and finish my puzzle. I've already done one puzzle, so I'll start that.
Very much so. Here,
Yes, I just, it's like a lot of it. But if I just did. I like a thin crust. A thin crust that's stiffy. Yeah, like cracker. Yeah, me too. I love that. I love that. It's hard to find it in the pizza hut. You used to have one of the best ones. They're thin and crispy crust. Yes, I know Ron. I've never been there. Oh, okay. They have really good time.
Rick, how's it?
Yeah. Yeah, they've got really good time. Pretty much everything.
The pizza has scissors to cut it. Yeah.
Really?
Yes.
It is good. And it's, one night a week. I forget which night it is. We like to sit at the bar and we'll get free drinks.
Call the meeting to order of the Commerce, Agriculture, and Natural Resources and Technology. We have two bills that we can already discuss. The first one is Decep's bill, which is Senate Bill 569, and I'm gonna call the bill.
Mr. Chairman, I think we're going to let staff quickly explain the bill, just so that we know what they did.
SB 569 provides an exemption for licensure for students that are in good standing and enrolled in a public institution of higher education, enrolled in a career training or technical education program, or an apprentice for work undertaken by a person providing construction, remodeling, repair, improvement, removal, or demolition on behalf of a properly licensed contractor. Raises the value threshold from $2,500 to $5,000, and adds
Mr. Chairman, I understand there's no physical impact, so I would move to report the bill.
Second. Move to second to report, Senate Bill 569. Everybody ready to vote?
Yes, sir.
All in favor, vote yes. All opposed, vote no. Opposed, vote 8-0, the bill is reported. Next is Senate Bill 580, and this is Senator Angus' bill. Mr. Chairman, this is the omnibus data bill. Several data bills floating around were all put into this bill. It creates the position of Chief Data Officer. We're responsible for developing guidelines and best practices for data sharing, storage, security, privacy, and compliance. Works with localities, works with the CIO, matters related to creation, storage, dissemination of data. Also creates a data sharing and analytics advisory committee that would help work with a short existence, about a year, that will work on a pilot project to implement many of the things here and advise this person. The impact is we already have funding in the House budget, and the Senate has funding in their budget to take care of that.
Mr. Chairman,
Yes, sir.
move to report the bill.
It's been moved and seconded to report Senator Angus' bill SB 580. All in favor, vote yes. All opposed, vote no. Clerk will close the vote. 8-0, the bill is reported. Dismissed.
And so, but it worked out fine, because they could have done it. Well,
Yeah. See, it's recorded.
Good idea. There you go.
Well, there he is, man. No,
Okay, we call the subcommittee of General Government Capital Outlay to order. Okay, Senator Reeves.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have before this subcommittee Senate Bill 471. Mr. Chairman, this has to do with the military mission improvement expansion projects. It came as about as part of the work product that I serve on the Commission on Military Installation and Defense Activities. And some of you haven't heard what that is. 2 previous governors ago, we had a real challenge with DoD spending, and the word on the street was a BRAC was coming. And a BRAC is a Base Realignment Closure Act. In Virginia, we have about, I think, 33 to 38 military installations, depending on which are classified and which aren't. And as a result on that, we didn't want to see us lose any facilities. In fact, Mr. Chairman, when the governor set up the Commission on Military Installation Defense Activities, he wanted to do an evaluation to understand where we were. So we've set all that up. And under one of the recommendations on that commission, which I've served on for 3 governors now, is to allow the ability under the code section under Virginia Public Building Authority, the opportunity to be able to move quickly if we needed to respond to some of the DoD requests or challenges that they face. And whether you're at Oceana or you're at Quantico, Mr. Chairman, those sort of things do happen. And I want to share with the committee a little bit of something I didn't share probably the last time I brought this bill forward, was how much Virginia actually gets out of the DoD budget. There's about 420 military installations, which include the District of Columbia, Guam, and Puerto Rico. Out of that, the #1 state that gets the most money in the United States is Virginia. And we get about 11.8% of the gross domestic product. But here's what's really interesting, Mr. Chairman, is that Defense spending in the Commonwealth of Virginia was $59.6 billion. $59.6 billion, or 13% of our gross state product. Military spending accounts for 44% of the federal monies that are in Virginia, 44%. So if we lose some of our military bases or posts, we're in trouble. There's no doubt about it. And I know you all are serving on finance, and that's an issue. So what this does is allow us the opportunity to do just that. It allows us that flexibility that we're going to need to respond what the Department of Defense might need going forward, or assist in the financing of those. And that's really what this bill does, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator. Any comments from the committee?
Senator Reeves, I know, I see exactly what you're trying to do. And I know what you're trying to do. And I guess up here, what we try to do is priorities. And as far as federal installations go, we've been taking about $15 million a year to roll back encroachment on Oceana, Fentress, and Langley, which we're doing that to roll back encroachment, which BRAC told us we had to do if we wanted to keep these installations. So I'm fighting again this year to try to get that money back to the budget. We funded this ever since we had that last round of BRAC,
Right.
and I'm continuing trying to fund it. And I know that we have to prioritize, and that's kind of a priority for me. So I just kind of want to explain to you the reason I'm probably going to be voting the way that I am.
Mr. Chairman, can I address that concern that Illinois has? Mr. Chairman, this would enhance that ability to do that under the authority. This is a language bill only. If there were more improvements that need to be done, it would allow us that opportunity, that flexibility to do that, to expand, develop, or redevelop any of those things. We're right now we're in the footing of our National Guard and some of those old armories we're giving back because we don't have the MILCON dollar for some of those things. And the mission set of our Guard has changed. Many of you probably know that we're in a different footing because of North Korea right now. Our Guard is painting vehicles from tan to green now. So that we're on a war footing with North Korea, or at least we've got the impression of that. And so we're going to have some costs associated with that. So this would just allow the Commission on Military and Defense Activities, with the approval of the governor, to work on some more of those issues. They don't necessarily have to have a dollar amount attached to it. This is language only.
Mr. Chairman, I'm going to hope like heck that I get my money this year, so I'm going to move to carry this bill over.
It's been moved and seconded that we carry over SB 471. All in favor of the motion, please vote sign of aye. In opposition? Thank you, Senator.
Thank you.
Senator DeStefan is not going to be here. The one on the agenda is Senate Bill 559. Senator DeStefan, this is an issue we looked at before in the House bill. It's identical to House Bill 1058, which we tabled, and it's very similar to 1139, which we tabled.
It's been moved. It's been moved and seconded that we table SB 559. Right here, please. Okay, vote is 8-0 to table. Thank you.
We ready?
Is it the full committee? All right.
One more?
One more four.
What's up? Yes.
All the bills on the block.
So which one is now? Which one? Okay.
I thought you had a thing in your hand. Go on.
All right, good luck with everything.
It's 2:30.
I will call the committee to order. I want to thank the subcommittee chairman and the subcommittee members for doing such a wonderful job. I know we're getting 4 back to back. I believe we have, 17, 18, 19 bills. And we're going to start off with the report of the HHR subcommittee. Susan?
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. I'm going to start with Senate Bill 310. This is Senator DeSteff's bill. And this is, the Senate substitute is a Section 1 bill, which requires the Department of Medical Assistance Services to make recommendations for legislative, regulatory, or policy changes.
Motion second. All in favor of reporting, please cast your vote. Clerk will open the roll. The clerk will close the roll. Bill reports 20-0. Susan?
The next bill, it has to do with child daycare licensure. It's Senate Bill 589 from Senator Hanger. It comes over as a substitute, an amendment in the nature of substitute from the Senate, and it was amended by the subcommittee.
Move the amendments, Mr. Chairman.
Have a motion and a second on the amendment. All in favor, please say aye. Aye. Opposed? All right, Susan.
This exempts a number, sets forth some provisions in the code which cleans up the area of the code related to licensure.
We have a motion and a second to report the bill as amended. Clerk will open the roll. Clerk will close the roll. The bill reports as amended, 20-0. Tony, good afternoon, my friend.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman. The next bill is Senator Stanley's Senate Bill 28.
And there's an amendment on that, correct?
Here's an amendment. The amendment substitute B 46.
There's a motion and a second on the amendment nature of substitute. All in favor, please say aye. Aye. Opposed? Again, the substitute is before us.
The substitute applies the prohibition to all funds that were appropriated, granted, or awarded by the Commonwealth directly to fund medically unnecessary research classified as Category E, which causes pain or distress to the substitute.
Motion and second to report. Clerk will open the roll. Clerk will close Substitute reports 20-0. Skip?
Mr. Chairman, SB 569, legislation provides exemption for licensure for students that are working for licensed construction contractors that are in good standing in a public private institution of higher education, enrolled in a career training technical education program or.
Is there an amendment to the bill?
No, sir.
Okay, do I have a motion?
Move to report.
Motion second to report. All in favor, please cast your vote. Clerk will close the roll. The report's 20-0.
SB 580 is the omnibus data bill. This is the one that establishes the position of chief data officer, who's going to be responsible for building guidelines, best practices for data sharing, storage, and security. Work with the
Motion second to report. All in favor, please cast your vote. Clerk will close the roll. Bill reports 21-0. All right.
Last one, SB 813, has to do with the annual report that for the MEI Commission. This basically says that the report should only include activity that has been published, incentives for which an offer has been made and publicly announced.
Okay.
Move the report.
Have a motion and a second to report SB 819. Please cast your vote. Bill reports 21-0. Susan.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman, members. First up, Senate Bill 229 from Senator Hanger requires the Board of Ed to establish a training program on autism spectrum disorders for all school bus drivers, their aides, and any employees who help assist getting kids.
I believe there's an amendment to this, correct?
No, sir, I think it came to us. The amendment we had was the physical impact statement. We had EPB recognize that we're going to be using, the DOE is going to be using an existing training module online. So that was the adjustment, but the language in the bill remained unchanged. So the vehicle for which, no pun intended, they were going to
There was an
provide the training.
understanding without need of an amendment?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
I'm trying to be clean and quick.
That's new for me. Okay, so we have a motion and a second on the bill. Yes. Yes, sir.
On that point, I don't, I've seen it, Susan has seen it, they were supposed to do that something Friday online, that was a special request.
Well, I tell you, why don't we do this? Why don't we just pass this by for the day?
Of course.
And we can meet on Monday and take care of it.
Yes, sir.
Because I know they're very quick to attach things to my bills in particular, on the other body. And so I think we want to slow the train down on this one. We'll trust but verify.
Mr. Chairman,
Yes, sir,
substitute
your
motion.
prerogative.
Substitute
Yes, sir.
motion.
Pass the bill by for the day.
All in favor, please say aye. Aye. Opposed? Thank you, Susan.
Next up, we have Senate Bill 261 from Senator Suderland. Permits any school division that's required to employ 2 full-time librarians at either middle or high schools to meet the SOQ requirement by hiring either 2 librarians or 1 librarian and either a media specialist or an instructional resource teacher.
Is this a
Mr.
referral?
Chairman,
Yes, sir, agree.
Mr. Chairman, I move that we refer this to the Committee on Education.
Motion and second to refer to the Committee on Education. Is that a voice vote? I believe it is. All in favor, please say aye. Aye. Opposed? All right.
Thank you. Next up, we have Senator Wagner's SB 658 allows the school boards participating in a regional or a joint school to be able to apply to the Board of Education for a loan from the literary fund to benefit the regional and joint school as any other school would be able to do permanently. There's no cost to it, and subcommittee recommended we
Mr. Chairman, move to report the bill.
We have a motion and second to report SB 658. All in favor, please cast your vote. All right, the clerk will close the roll. Bill reports 21-0. Susan?
And lastly, we have Senator Locke's bills, SB 775, which allows a student in a military family whose parent has received a deployment or relocation order to remain in their enrolled current school without being, through the end of the school year, without being charged tuition, and also allows that child to go prior to the family actually moving to enroll into a new school so they won't have a disrupted school division. DOE will put them in ADM so they can, school board.
Second.
All in favor, please cast your vote.
Thank you so much.
The clerk will close the roll. Bill reports 21-0. David?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First up is Senate Bill 47 from Senator Black. There's an amendment to
Chair, move the amendment.
Motion and second on the amendment. All in favor of the amendment, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? The bill is amended as before us.
The bill elevates to a felony the act of female genital mutilation.
Second.
A motion and second to report SB 47. All in favor, please cast your vote. Clerk will close the roll. Bill reports 22-0. David?
Next is Senate Bill 426 from Senator Wexton. There's an amendment to remove clause.
Move the amendment, Mr. Chairman.
All in favor of the amendment, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? The bill is before us as amended.
The bill requires clerk's support to provide information published by DCJS for victims of domestic violence or petitioners in protective order cases. There is no fiscal impact.
Move the report as amended, Mr. Chairman.
Motion is second on the bill as amended. All in favor, please cast your vote in the electronic vote machine. All right, close the roll. The bill reports as amended, 22-0. David, lastly?
Senate Bill 716 from Senator Chase. There's an amendment to remove
Mr. Chairman, move
clause.
the amendment.
Amendment, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Bill before us as amended.
The bill requires state police to assess and report back on ways to expedite the background check process. There is no fiscal impact to the bill.
Mr. Chairman, move the report as amended.
All in favor, please cast your vote. All right, the bill reports as amended, 22-0. Ann?
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman. The Transportation Subcommittee had one bill that was just heard, Senate Bill 73. There is an amendment.
Mr. Chairman, move the amendment.
Motion second on the amendment.